Africa was never behind. It was stolen from if you were the wealthiest person on the planet. In the year 1324, you weren't living in London, Paris, or Rome. You were likely crossing the Sahara Desert with a caravan of 60,000 people and enough gold to collapse the economy of every nation you passed through. This was Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, and his journey is a reminder of a truth we have largely forgotten. For centuries, Africa was the center of global wealth, higher education, and technological innovation. But today, when we look at a map, we see a continent labeled as underdeveloped or struggling. We are told a story of a place that is only now catching up to the rest of the world. But what if that story is backwards? What if Africa isn't behind, but was intentionally pushed off its own track? To understand the Africa of today, we have to look past the headlines and uncover the blueprint of a continent that was thriving long before the world decided it needed saving. For over a millennium, African civilizations were the primary architects of global trade. In West Africa, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai controlled the world's supply of gold and salt. These weren't just mining camps. They were sophisticated bureaucracies with standardized weights, measures, and judicial systems. In the city of Timbuktu, the University of Sankar was teaching astronomy, mathematics, and complex surgery at a time when most of Europe believed the Earth was flat. To the east, the Aksumite Empire in modern-day Ethiopia was one of the first four global superpowers, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. They minted their own coins and created an architectural style of massive stone obelisks that still baffle engineers today. In the south, the Great Zimbabwe civilization built a metropolis of stone without a drop of mortar walls 30 feet high that have stood for nearly 1,000 years. These were not primitive societies. They were the pinnacle of human achievement. The shift from being a global leader to a developing region didn't happen by accident. It began with the most massive theft in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. For 400 years, the strongest, smartest, and most capable members of African society, the farmers, the metal workers, the artists, and the leaders, were forcibly removed from the continent. This wasn't just a loss of people. It was a total knowledge drain. When you remove 15 million of a society's most productive individuals, the social and economic gears of that civilization don't just slow down, they grind to a halt. Trade routes that had existed for centuries collapsed, and the focus of African life shifted from innovation to survival. The continent was effectively robbed of its future labor and its intellectual capital, providing the free human energy that built the economies of the Americas and Europe while leaving its own homelands hollowed out. But the theft of people was followed by the theft of the land itself. In 1884, at a conference in Berlin, European leaders who had never set foot on the continent took a map and a ruler and divided Africa into artificial nations. They drew lines through kingdoms, splitting ethnic groups in half and forcing rival tribes into the same borders. These borders were never designed to foster a functional society. They were designed for extraction. The railways built during the colonial era are a perfect example of this. They didn't connect African cities to one another to create an internal market. They ran in straight lines from the mines and the rubber plantations directly to the ports so that wealth could be shipped out as quickly as possible. This created a fragmented continent where countries were wealthy in resources, but poor in the infrastructure needed to serve their own citizens. The economic pillage continued through the systematic draining of capital, known as illicit financial flows. Even after independence, billions of dollars continued to leak out of the continent every year through tax evasion, shell companies, and unfair trade pricing. According to UN estimates, Africa loses roughly $88.6 billion annually to these flows, a figure that often exceeds the total amount of foreign aid the continent receives. This creates a cruel irony where Africa is effectively a net creditor to the rest of the world, providing more wealth to global financial centers than it gets back in assistance. The poverty we see is often a result of wealth being siphoned away before it can ever be invested in local hospitals, schools, or industries. Furthermore, the theft of history was just as damaging as the theft of gold. For decades, colonial historians claimed that Africa had no history prior to European arrival, dismissing grand structures like the walls of Benin, once the world's largest earthworks, as mysteries built by outsiders. The Kingdom of Benin featured a city planned with mathematical precision and lit by street lamps, yet its magnificent bronzes were looted and scattered across European museums. By erasing these achievements from the global consciousness, the world justified its civilizing mission, ignoring the fact that African metallurgy, textile production, and agricultural science were, in many cases, superior to European methods at the time of first contact. The intellectual theft extended into the realm of science and medicine. For instance, the practice of variolation, an early form of inoculation against smallpox, was introduced to the American colonies by an enslaved African man named Onesimus, who shared the knowledge he had brought from his homeland. In the 1870s, European travelers in Uganda were shocked to witness indigenous surgeons performing successful Caesarean sections using antiseptic techniques and anesthesia, methods that were still being perfected in the West. Africa was a laboratory of innovation, yet the names of its scientists and their contributions were largely omitted from the archives of human progress. In the modern era, the extraction has evolved into a digital and mineral scramble. Africa holds roughly 30% of the world's remaining mineral reserves, including the vast majority of the cobalt and tantalum required for the smartphones and electric car batteries that power the green revolution. Yet, the value added to these minerals happens elsewhere, leaving African nations with the environmental scars of mining, but only a fraction of the profits. This structural inequality is not a failure of African potential, but a successful feature of a global economic architecture designed to keep the continent as a supplier of raw materials rather than a manufacturer of finished goods. The legacy of debt-trap diplomacy has also placed a heavy burden on African growth. Many nations spend more on interest payments to international lenders than they do on the healthcare or education of their own children. This debt is often rooted in the high-risk premiums placed on African countries by credit rating agencies, which can cost the continent up to $74.5 billion a year in excess interest. These financial shackles prevent governments from making the long-term investments necessary to rebuild the social fabric that was torn apart during the colonial era. When African nations finally regained their independence in the mid-20th century, they weren't handed a blank slate. They inherited a system designed for their own exploitation. They were born into massive debt using currencies pegged to their former colonizers and forced to participate in a global market that paid pennies for their raw, materials, cobalt, gold, and cocoa, while charging them a premium for the finished goods made from those very same materials. This is why a continent with the world's largest reserves of precious minerals often struggles with basic electricity. The system was built to export power, not to generate it for the people living there. However, the underdevelopment of Africa is not its destiny. Today, we are seeing a historical correction. Because traditional systems were so broken, African innovators are leapfrogging the rest of the world. In nations like Kenya and Nigeria, people are skipping traditional landline phones and moving straight to mobile banking systems that are more advanced than those in the West. The stolen momentum is being reclaimed by a generation that views the ruins of Great Zimbabwe and the manuscripts of Timbuktu not as ancient history, but as a reminder of what they are capable of achieving. Africa is not developing to become like the West. It is remembering how to be itself. The story of Africa isn't one of a slow start, but of a magnificent runner who was tripped and is finally getting back to their feet.